As I said again, I'm Crystal. I'm the Director of Marketing here at QuestionPro. That's me. And I'm here with Dan, President of Research and Insights, and he is going to be kind of leading the charge today on our survey questions: when, what, and how to ask. So let's get started.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Crystal. First, I want to go over the QuestionPro research platform just to give everybody a background on what that is. So it's the most powerful suite of research tools to help you make better decisions and forge amazing experiences. I think Crystal's fond of that because she came up with that line. But really what it allows for is our survey platform that includes point and click logic, advanced question types like conjoint and max diff, some of which we'll get into a little bit today, but even others like card sorting and heat map, hotspot question types, and everything else you need to make those or derive research insights rather. And then we have the communities platform. So that's where you can manage and maintain a hyper-engaged community of your brand's top promoters or people that are in a similar group, and you can do agile research with them. You can also do qualitative research through discussion boards, idea boards, and then video focus groups as well. So a bunch of different qualitative insights that you can get from your community platform. And then Audience, which is our online sample platform, which you can choose from over 22 million mobile-ready respondents to conduct your research, and this is globally as well. And then we can also help you out on your studies. So whether that is, hey, I need help programming the survey, I need analysis, whatever that might be, through our services and partnerships, you can have us do the heavy lifting. So that is really the research platform at large here at QuestionPro. Encompasses all of those different products and services. But today I want to talk a little bit about survey questions and going over some of the best, like setting research objectives, understanding your target audience, optimal survey design and survey length, survey branching, examples of poorly written questions. I'll give you some good examples of poorly written questions. So that's kind of an oxymoron, but makes sense. And then interesting question types to include, and then some mistakes and gotchas to avoid. Now, these are just some best practices. Obviously, in the survey world, people have their preferences on how they like survey questions, how they think survey questions should be asked. There's some different schools of thought, but I'll give you in general what I know about survey questions and what we have seen as some of the best examples around each one of these points here. So without further ado, let's get into it. So setting research objectives, this should really be the first thing that you do even before you start thinking about survey questions. So let's say you're going on a road trip. You probably wouldn't go on a road trip without first putting the location in your GPS, especially if you don't know where you're going. You want to make sure that you're taking the easiest, quickest, most efficient route there without traffic delays, problems, road closures, etc. It's really similar when you are developing a survey as well. You want to make sure that you're setting those research objectives so you have a clear roadmap of where you're going and what you're trying to accomplish. With that comes working with key stakeholders to establish the objectives of the study. You want to make sure that you have their buy-in so that once the survey or research has been conducted, they're not coming back and asking you, well, maybe you should have asked this or asked that. There's some, I guess, solace or some comfort in saying, oh, well, this was outside of the scope of the research objectives that we all bought into. So I think that's a good point, that make sure you're working with the key stakeholders to establish the objectives. And then the objectives should be specific and measurable. You want to make sure that you can tie these back to clear points and make sure that there's also good action verbs inside of these objectives that you're creating. So you want to compare something, to calculate, to identify. You don't want to use non-action verbs like I want to understand or to believe or to notice. Those are really too abstract, and you need more, those can be too subjective as well. Like one thing that you might believe might be different than what someone else believes. But if you can use words like I want to compare two things, that's clear. To calculate, obviously that's a definitive number. To identify, so clear objectives help lead to good research overall. So definitely start with the objectives even before you get in to realizing what survey questions you want to ask. And keep these 3 points in mind when writing and organizing your survey. So what decisions are you trying to make? What criteria are you using to make your decisions? And then whose opinion do you need to make that decision? So if people, even if people have already given you a list of questions, set them aside and answer these 3 questions first. And then this will better enable you to really analyze the survey questions that not only that you're creating, or if someone's giving you the list of questions. These are good questions just to, if you answer these, you can make sure that they apply to either the survey that you're writing or the survey that that you are looking over or programming inside of QuestionPro. And really, even if you didn't come up with the survey, if you ask yourself these things and you know the objectives, you can take a look at the objectives and then look at the survey questions themselves. And just as a double check for that person that created the survey, maybe if you see that one of these research objectives isn't clearly met within the survey, or that you can see it, maybe bring it up to that person. It could be a good +1 of just double checking and making sure that those research objectives are being adequately answered or asked inside of the survey. So when you're developing your survey, you want to keep 3 things in mind. Really, fatigue. So respondents become mentally exhausted either due to length, repetitiveness, overwhelming complexity. If there's a lot of terminology or really things that respondents have to closely pay attention to, this will be there'll be some fatigue or that they'll be experiencing, so they'll be not as alert in answering your survey. We'll talk about it, but survey length is obviously a key component here. Answerability. So respondents are unable to provide accurate answers if they have insufficient knowledge or an inability to recall, so unsatisfactory multiple choice options, or an unwillingness to provide an honest answer. So I think really here, you need to make sure that respondents are able to provide accurate responses, and make sure they have enough information to answer the particular question that you want them to, either through screening, or maybe you need to give some tips or just some additional context inside of the question. That helps with making sure that the respondent has everything they need to adequately answer the question. And then clarity, be clear and concise. And respondents misinterpret or fail to understand questions that are poorly worded, or there's paraphrasing in the question, or maybe the phrasing isn't quite right. The clarity obviously helps, and this kind of goes back into making sure that you have a clear roadmap for your research questions, and that when you're setting up that GPS before your road trip, you make sure that it's the best, most clearest route for you to go on your journey. It's really the same thing here. You want to make sure that these question types are clear. So think about the fatigue, making sure that your respondents can answer the questions, and that everything inside of the survey is clear. There's some clarity around those different questions or answer options as well. Some survey design tips that we have for you are: make sure to clearly structure your survey. And what this means is have a clear introduction, followed by a screener, and then the body of the survey, the bulk questions, and then of course your demographics. This will help you, obviously the researcher, know where different things are in the survey, but it will also help the respondent, because the questions will have similar context, especially in the body. If you're asking questions maybe about a particular product or service, all of those will be in one spot, and there's not so much bouncing around. I think also in this you can add different cues. So maybe the next section will be talking about X, and then after that section you bring up another. This section will be talking about X, Y, Z. So that way respondents know kind of what's expected of them, and they can keep that in mind. So definitely keep the medium in mind when you are creating your survey. Don't forget about mobile. Although QuestionPro's question types are all mobile friendly, device optimized, and device agnostic, you want to make sure that you're keeping this in mind. We're seeing now that 50% plus of surveys are done on mobile. So you need to make sure that questions are concise, that they're clear. Obviously, there's less real estate on a mobile phone than there is a desktop browser. So you need to think about that in terms of when you're developing questions, that overly wordy questions or answer options will not show up well on a mobile device. Know your audience and what they can handle. If it's a general consumer versus specialized respondent, this is where if it's a specialized respondent or even more in a B2B space, if you're screening and you know that you have the correct respondent, you can get into some of that terminology that maybe is more specific to the industry and they would know. But if you're asking a general consumer to comment on specific terminology, obviously they may not know that. So really knowing your audience and who you're asking can definitely help you out here. I've been harping on this a lot, but clear and concise keep your research goals in mind. So the quickest way that you can get from point A to point B is the easiest. And this will help in not only survey length, but also making sure that the questions you're asking are straight and to the point and aren't meandering. All right, so the optimal length of your surveys. So a key study a couple of years ago said that respondents check out after 15 to 20 minutes. I think nowadays it's probably less than that. So, 10 to 12 minutes tends to be the optimal length that we see at QuestionPro in terms of the survey length. And even in most of the times, keeping it under 10 minutes is good. My kind of rule of thumb is if it's anything over 15 to 20 minutes, typically maybe you should break it up into 2 surveys or be more concise about your research, or perhaps use more branching or randomization to ask certain subsets different questions. You'll still maybe in the end arrive at the same result, but you'll be asking fewer questions of so many people, so that way your survey length goes down. So on average, surveys distributed on QuestionPro, the average is about 35 questions in a survey. Obviously, there's some longer surveys, some shorter ones, but the average we see is about 35 questions. Although, I've seen survey questions or surveys that have hundreds of questions in them. Typically, those have a lot of logic and are asking certain sections to specific respondents. So that's what we're seeing there. And then if you do have a longer survey and you can't avoid it, typically having a save and continue option is a good rule of thumb. And that's where a respondent can hit save and continue, and then they can enter in an email address, and then that link will be emailed to them, so they can start off at the same spot that they, hit the save and continue. So that's a good way to go about it. Also, the links inside of QuestionPro, if you're sending it through email, will be so if the respondent does click out of it, if they click that link again, it'll end up in the same spot where they left off. So, but definitely including a save and continue option for those longer surveys is a good rule of thumb. So here are some survey question tips. So overall, your survey questions should help you answer the research objectives. This is kind of a no-brainer, right? This is why we're doing the study. This is why we're asking the questions to begin with, to make sure that we're meeting those research objectives. Ask specific and relevant questions. So you want to make sure that these are relevant to those objectives and the questions you are trying to answer. Avoid confusing technical or unfamiliar terms. So obviously bringing these things up, and we've touched on it a little bit here, overly technical questions to a respondent that doesn't, or maybe isn't aware of those technical capabilities of your product or service, obviously isn't gonna make sense. Keep respondents on track, and you can do this by having a progress bar. Again, having those cues inside of the survey, saying, okay, just a few more questions, or in this next section, we're going to be asking about this. And then that way you're keeping those respondents on that sort of that GPS that we've been talking about here in this webinar, where it keeps not only you on track, but also the respondent on track, and knowing what's the quickest way I can get from point A to point B. And the most clarity is obviously keeping those respondents on track and guiding them through the survey. So keep loaded questions and phrases off the table. I think this is just good research practice in general. You want to be as unbiased as possible, right? You want to, no matter in what you do inside of research, you want to limit the amount of bias that you're introducing into any study. So keeping these loaded questions and phrases off the table is of paramount importance here. So use the KISS principle, keep it simple, stupid. Obviously, you want to keep it as simple as possible. There's no need for complex wording, complex question types if you don't need it. And even then, keep it simple with clearly articulated sentences, questions, and answer options. And then use scales when possible. I think this is a good rule of thumb, so that way you can get clear measurable data. And also, if you go back to those research objectives, you want to be able to calculate or to identify something. And scales is definitely one way to go. And we'll also talk about max diff scaling and conjoint as well. So those are two question types that we'll talk a little bit about here as interesting question types to use in your research. All right, some examples of poorly written questions. So these are all around the MBA. I'm kind of getting excited for the MBA to come back in full swing here, or maybe not quite full swing, but whatever the new normal is for the MBA. So an example of a poorly written question is, what are your suggestions for the Los Angeles Lakers? At face value, this might seem like a good question, but it's really too subjective, and it's not, it's too open-ended. I mean, the suggestions around this could be anything from, is it on the court performance? Is it their logo? Is it their city? Is it the arena that they play in? It's not specific enough to adequately answer the question. So a better question might be, what suggestions do you have for the Lakers around player development? Or what suggestions do you have for the Lakers at the trade deadline? So giving a specific context around what you're getting at would be a better way to word this question. The next question is, who is currently the best player in the NBA? Is it Stephen Curry, LeBron James, Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard? Obviously, these are all good players, but you're leaving out a lot of possible options that people might select. So a better way to structure this question would be either to include a none of the above, or to include an other option. Those would be two ways that you could kind of combat other entries in this question. And then even then, if it's an other and you get a certain percentage of, let's say in other you get someone answering another player and it's a high enough percentage, you can always add it into your answer options here. So that would be a better way to word this, to structure the answer options here. So that way you're addressing the largest possible, I guess, option base of players that might get selected here. And the next example, how many NBA championships will the Golden State Warriors win with Steph Curry? So I think it's pretty clear here, but these answer options aren't mutually exclusive. So if I said 4, would I select option B or C? So having these overlapping answer options will lead to obviously inaccurate data. So a better use here would be 0 to 2, maybe 3 to 4, or 5 to 6, and then 7 or 6 plus. So I would even probably do it a little bit different, and you could even just get a whole number and have them type that in, or have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 each as individual options. So there's a number of different things that you could do here, but just to make it so that you're getting the most accurate data. And then another example of a poorly worded question, and this might be an example of leading, is 5-time NBA MVP Michael Jordan the greatest basketball player of all time? Well, initially, because we're adding in the 5-time NBA MVP, we're biasing the question, and you'd want to leave it as, is Michael Jordan the greatest basketball player of all time? So that might be a better way to word this question so that you're not leading or providing biased information in this particular question. So those are examples of 4 sort of poorly written questions that could be improved, not only the question, but the answer option itself. All right, let's jump into some interesting question types to include. I have 3 examples for you here. If you're doing any sort of customer satisfaction work, you're going to want to include the Net Promoter Score question or NPS question type. This will give you an example, or this will really let you know who your detractors, your passives, and your promoters are by, based on this rating system. And then also through this, you'll get an NPS score as well that you can compare against industry averages. So that way you can see how your company or business is tracking against those other companies in a similar industry. So this is a interesting question type to include, and one that I'd recommend if you're doing any sort of customer satisfaction rating. I'm sure we've all seen this question type, especially after you buy something online, after you take a flight, or whatever it might be. Every company wants to know, how likely would you be to recommend to a product or colleague? Some other interesting question types and ones that I really like to see in surveys is one of the max diff question type. So if you have a list of options here or different attributes, you can really get which one has the highest share of preference. So but by asking respondents a battery of questions on most or least preferred, in the analysis, you can get which one has the highest share of preference, and then obviously you can see the share of preference that each of the other options would have as well. One interesting thing that you can do is if you're asking a battery of rating scale questions, let's say it's on a 1 to 5 scale, typically most of them fall in with like 3.7, 3.6, 3.8, somewhere in that range. So the differentiation between each one is not that high. So it's hard to get a clear sense of which one is most important or least important. One thing you can do is take that same question, put it into a max diff, and then you'll clearly get a good, you'll be able to clearly see the most important and least important, and then all the options in between. So it's kind of a good way to ask those rating scale questions that maybe traditionally you've asked in a sort of a battery on a 1 to 5 scale. Another one is discrete choice conjoint. So if you're doing any sort of product research or packaging and what you want to see inside of a particular product in terms of maybe it's the particular brand or the price, the size, this is all around TVs, and you want to see which profile makes up the best possible option for my product, you can use discrete choice conjoint to do that. So this will give you the best and worst profile, that is which combinations of features or attributes make up the product that someone would most likely to buy. And then through this, there's different market simulators that you can run. You can get utility values and so forth inside of this discrete choice conjoint. So there's a lot of additional information that you can get aside from, okay, yeah, I know that these attributes make up the best product that I could come up with. And then another, another thing that you can do inside of surveys to make them not only more intelligent, but also to make sure that you're asking questions of the right respondent is to use survey branching. So branching logic, we also have where you can put questions into different blocks and do logic based on those question blocks, and also randomization based on those question blocks. So this really helps out with, showing, let's say you have five pictures and you want to randomly show one of these pictures to a respondent. You can do that via having these branching and also these survey blocks. So product testing, concept testing can easily be done by using this method as well. But really it helps you create more intelligent surveys by creating a custom path for respondents. You can also reduce your survey length by maybe you ask you kind of randomize the different questions or only ask certain questions of certain people. So that way you're reducing the overall number of questions that you're asking to the respondents. And then respondents can answer relevant questions that are relevant to them based on their previous choices. So as you're screening them, you can only show them the questions that they need to see or that they want to see. And you can use simple skip logic, like on a question, if they answer A, I want them to go to question 3 in the survey. Everybody else I want to terminate. You can do those sorts of simple skip logic. You can also do extraction logic. So this would be based on my multi-select question type. If the respondent answers 3, I want to take those 3 options and ask a follow-up question just on those 3 options. This can easily be done. In addition to show or hiding questions based on previous answer choices, this can be done as well. So your surveys can really get smart. And even though you may have 50 questions, it's not like all of those questions are going to be shown to every respondent. So that'll help your survey length as well. And then some mistakes and gotchas to avoid. So we've been talking a little bit about this, but questions that are confusing or misleading, like some of those poorly written ones that we went over, you want to avoid those. Questions that are too long and that are hard to follow, especially in the question text and answer options, you want to make sure those are clear and concise, like we've been harping on here. Don't identify specific issues or problems. Use ambiguous rating systems. So you want to make sure that the rating systems that you're using are clear, especially if you're using custom rating systems that might have, it's not very dissatisfied to very satisfied. Maybe you're putting in your own nomenclature or terminology there. You want to make sure that's clear and easily understood by the respondents. And then surveys don't provide the customer with the ability to clarify answers. So a lot of times this is handled by having the open end at the end of the survey with, is there anything else that you want to tell us? Or that would be one way that you could do this, or allowing them to clarify those answers. That being said, sometimes open-ended responses can be difficult to quantify through analysis because they are so open-ended. But luckily, QuestionPro does have some text analytics and sentiment analysis tools to help you with your open-ended responses to help group these and add sentiment around them. So while it can be difficult, there are some tools within QuestionPro that you can use to better quantify this. Like I mentioned, if it's the text analysis, the sentiment analysis, even a word cloud can help you easily identify some key trends. Obviously, the bigger the word, the more times it was mentioned. So while it could be a problem, there are some tools that we have that can help you there. So just to recap, some of the best practices here are: have a clear introduction that states the purpose of your survey. Ask screening questions next, so that clear path to make sure they qualify. If someone doesn't qualify, you don't want to waste their time or ask those screener questions at the end of the survey. It doesn't make any sense. So make sure all of your screening questions are towards the beginning of the survey. Ask the most important questions first in the survey when your respondents are likely to be fresh and less fatigued. Mix in simple and complex questions. So the best that you can, mix in some of the single select questions along with maybe a matrix question. And then if you're making use of the conjoin or max diff, make sure you don't have too many of those exercises within one survey, kind of limit it to 1 or 2 max. And then have a good thank you page that really lets the respondent know that they're done with the survey, or if you're having them do another action after the survey, that is mentioned in the thank you page. And then thank them for their time. I think that's one of the most important things that you can do. They're taking their time to participate in the survey, and thanking them, I know, goes a long way. All right, and then really make informed decisions based on your survey. So this is really the next level that you can take it with analysis that you're doing, asking these survey questions because you're answering those research objectives that address a particular problem or something that you wanted to find out about your business. So through the analysis comes actionable business decisions. Use all of the features and functionality that we have inside of QuestionPro through analysis charts, advanced cross-tabulation, correlation analysis. If you're making use of max diff or discrete choice, there's specific analysis modules just based on those question types. So those are all things that you can use to help tell a compelling story. I mean, at the end of the day, if you collect the research but you're not able to tell that compelling story, it could be generally useless because no one is going to be buying into that story or seeing how it matches those research objectives. Without good data and good analysis, we just have opinions written. That doesn't do anybody any good because everybody has a different opinion. But we need actionable data to make well-informed decisions. And this is what these survey questions can do if they're well worded. They'll match those research objectives. And if we go back to those research objectives, they're really clear, right? We're using the good action verbs to calculate and to identify, those sorts of action verbs that will really help us in our analysis and to have that actionable data so that we can make these informed decisions. All right, with that, I think, Crystal, we can open it up to any questions that are out there.
Perfect. We've got some good ones. So I'm gonna organize them by some of the easiest first, I think.
Okay, I'll take that.
Okay, when is the best time to send an electronic survey invite to the general public or to a business audience?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and it varies, and I think it changes quite a bit, because if you were talking about, during the coronavirus or the pandemic, we're seeing high response rates pretty much across the board, no matter when you send it. Obviously, if you're sending it, you don't want to send it during the middle of the night, but generally people are at home and they're answering more surveys. Even in our audience business, we're seeing, good response rates and things from people. So I would say now what we're seeing is, any time is really a good time to send the survey, except at night. For business, it can be kind of hit and miss depending on the industry, but from what we're seeing, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, sometime either in the morning or afternoon tends to be good times. But because everybody is mobile now and they have a device, typically it's not like, oh, I only need to reach them during office hours. If they're checking their email, they're doing different things outside of that and on the go. So there's some good times, and I can send some follow-up information around some specific research that we've done. But in general, we're seeing good response rates across the board at varying times throughout the day.
Perfect. We did a blog post about it back in January, and so I dropped that into the chat for anybody who wants to check it out.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So that's perfect.
Okay, and then how many questions should a survey be limited to? And it was one question, and then somebody else also asked, what is the longest survey feasibly?
I mean, feasibly, if you have the right respondent, I would say anything over, 25, 30 minutes, people start to check out, and the data that you're getting isn't going to be as good as if you were able to parse that survey down into smaller chunks. In terms of questions, it really depends, because I've seen where there are, 100, 200 questions in a survey, but because of the logic and the different skip patterns, it only takes, 15 to 20 minutes to answer that survey. So I think it's hard to base it on number of questions, but the average survey that we see is 35. But depending
is it more
on
about time?
Yeah, it's really more about time, and then the length of those questions as well. Another good tip is to not include, more than probably 2 to 3 open-ended responses, because that could have a drastic increase on the amount of time that your survey takes as well, and also the fatigue on the respondents.
I gotcha. So if you have a lot of questions, how should you prioritize them?
Yeah, if you have a lot of questions, perhaps you can, put it into, so you're not asking the whole block of questions to every respondent. Maybe if you're collecting, let's say, 1,000 responses, you can group those questions so that you're only asking, you're breaking it down so that some people get a block of questions and other people get a different block, and other people get a different block. So collectively, you're probably arriving at the same overall response in terms of responses, and collectively you're going to get the same data at the end, but you're going to be asking it to less people is what I'm meaning to say there. So you can ask those survey questions to less people. Still have the same N, or the number of completes that you're getting, but you don't need to ask all those questions to everybody, especially if you have a lot, or you're gonna have to prioritize them and kind of break them down. If you can't do that, then you want to make sure that you are only asking those questions that are relevant to the research objectives, or break it down into multiple surveys.
Okay, that's interesting. So taking your group of respondents and breaking down, let's say the 100 answer 1 through 5, another 100 answer 6 through 10.
That's right. Yep. That's what I was trying to say there. And got a little tongue tied, but I think you guys got it. But it really, and we can do that easily within QuestionPro through doing block randomization and making sure that it's unbiased as well. So there's some different tools and techniques inside of QuestionPro that will help you achieve that.
That's awesome. How many respondents should you have for a survey to be valid?
It really, I mean, the magic number is 400. I think it's a little bit less than that, is 397. But I think it really depends on the number of segments that you want to break the answer, or that you want to break the data into, and then to make sure that you have enough responses there. But I think to be statistically reliable, there's different confidence intervals, but I think it's 397, or I mean, people just kind of round it up to 400, but it's somewhere within there based on the different confidence levels that you want to have in the data. So if it's 95 or 98% confident, yeah.
So when people, like when these nationwide surveys and polls say they've surveyed only 1,000 people for the whole country, that actually does hit has like over 400.
Depending on who they've surveyed and so forth, but there's going to be a lot of variance in there. So that's where you might see, like, the plus or minus 5% or whatever it might be on particular questions, because that's that's like the degree of confidence or certainty they have in those responses.
Okay, cool. This one's a little, okay, here we go. When do you think about trying to break up people just answering agree, 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 but including items with negatives? So like 1, the intake nurse was efficient in taking my vitals. The reception staff was not willing to work with my schedule. What's the best way to do that?
Got it. I would keep like the sentiment the same. So keep it all positive or all negative. But if you're trying to break up straight liners, what I would probably do is you can say, for this choice, select satisfied, right? So then that way you can make sure that they're reading the actual response. They're selecting the answer that you want them to. So you could do that. I think it's maybe called like a red herring or something like that. Another thing you can do is use our data quality tools, and we have tools to identify straight liners, and it'll flag the response. So that way you can go back and check it in culmination with a few other factors, like the amount of time that it took for the respondent to answer the survey. And then also you can pair that with if there was straight lining or these other data quality tools that we have. And then you can really get a good sense if that's a valid response or not, or if someone was just speeding through the survey.
Cool, good to know. And then can you talk about the virtues of randomly selecting respondents versus an open invitation survey? So
randomly versus an open invitation. I think it would largely depend on what you're going after. I mean, if it's an open invitation survey, it would kind of depend on how you're collecting the data. If it's something that you're just putting an open invitation on, like Facebook or Twitter, it depends on the audience you're going after. I would think that I think random is always better because it can reduce your bias, but it could be dependent on the particular audience that you're going after for that survey. And maybe if you're putting them on your Facebook page, maybe that's your target market. So in that case, that's what I would do. But if you have a large customer list and you have the ability to randomly select who that survey is going to, it helps to reduce bias, which I think is a key component.
Nice. Great. Well, looks like all of our questions.
Great.
I really want to thank everyone for coming and for participating. These are always great, and we're trying to come up with really interesting topics every 4th Monday of the month. So something that's a little bit more closed lane, so it's not just random or too vague for everyone. So if you have any ideas, you can always hit us up directly on any of our platforms like shown here. And a few of you reached out with very direct questions. So I'm going to have Dan and I reach out to you personally about, you know, how we can help solve your problems or what best product is good for you guys. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Everyone have a good day or evening.
Morning, whatever
Morning,
time.
whatever time. All
Okay,
right.
thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody. All right. See you later. Bye.